So my name is Chandler Jordan. I am the program director for SC Economics. We are a nonprofit with our mission is to help teachers teach economics and personal finance right here in South Carolina. We've got a lot of familiar faces or names in here. Only one familiar, beautiful face over here, but we've got lots of good participants tonight. We've got a couple more who will probably join us as the night progresses. But I want to go ahead and kick this over to Dr. Nicholas Molman. He is a wonderful professor of economics at Winthrop University. And I got to know Dr. Molman through Dr. Stone. You guys know Gary Stone. He brought him into our club. And when I say our club, I mean our board at SC Economics. And he has been a huge asset. I really enjoyed working with him over the past, I feel like it's been almost 2 years now, but the pandemic makes it feel so long. That being said, I'm gonna kick it to you to talk to us a little bit about labor markets and employment trends.
All right, well, thank you so much, Chandler, and thank you everybody for being here. One thing that you're going to see, I see one person supporting Winthrop already, favorite in the chat. So one thing that you're going to kind of realize as we go through the night is obviously, I am a professor at Winthrop, and I don't know if I can necessarily turn that off when I'm talking about econ. And so, you know, I'm going to be asking questions. I want you all to ask me questions. You know, I'm talking about a topic that I really love and I really am passionate about. As I'll talk about a little bit later, I study poverty for my research agenda. And so very, very closely tied to labor markets and labor problems. And so today we're going to be spending a little bit of time going through kind of some of the basics, and then, well, might as well just go ahead and get started. You guys can see with me here. So I'm going to share my screen and move your faces over here and make it into a grid too, so I can spread that out. Make sure that we're sharing computer sound, and we will go ahead and get started. So once again, welcome, Nicholas Molman. Here is all of my contact information. So when I say please reach out if you have any questions, please reach out if you have any questions. I would love to chat with you guys. If you have, you know, students who are interested in Winthrop, whether it be for economics or for anything else, I really love the institution that I'm at. I'm an assistant professor there, and I'm the director of the Center for Economic Education. As Chandler mentioned earlier, Gary Stone, Dr. Stone, he was the previous director, and as he is slowly making his way into retirement, Gary will never leave. I am, you know, kind of stepping in to help out there. And so, you know, by training, what I do is kind of this mixture of what's called labor, public, and health economics. And so I know that not all of you are necessarily, you know, full-on, full-bore econ people, but what that means is that I like to think about people and how people interact both kind of in a work setting, but also in kind of a public assistance setting. So I, you know, do work on Medicaid and how Medicaid is funded, or I look at things like the relationship between food insecurity and personal well-being. And so these are the things that I really get passionate about and really like talking about. And so once again, happy to be here today. You know, I saw some support already in the chat for Winthrop University. If you're not familiar, we are a public liberal arts institution in Rock Hill, South Carolina. One of the things that we like to kind of tout ourselves for is being both diverse and high touch, meaning that we get students from all over who come to our university that aren't necessarily the typical university student. Winthrop has been the most diverse campus that I've been a part of. I'm originally from Oklahoma. I've taught in Wisconsin, I've taught in Kentucky, and I really, really love my students here at Winthrop. And so I think we have something special. And part of that is that we get to know our students at Winthrop University. So when I have a class of 15, 20, 25 students, by the end of week 2 or week 3, I know all their names, and which is really great, as I'm sure, you know, teachers are aware. When you ask a question, you sit there silently and you say, Lucy, what do you think? You know, you can kind of call them out, and they love that. They love being called out. No, not so much, but really enjoy where I am. And so if you guys have any questions about the university, please feel free to reach out to me as well. So today we're going to be talking about labor markets in general, and we're going to start with kind of understanding why people choose to work, We're going to move on to talk about what labor markets are and how we might go about showing that to some of our students. And then I'm going to spend a fair bit of time just kind of showing you all data and showing you graphs. Economist, I like graphs, I like pictures, even though I am colorblind. So if I say the wrong color, feel free to correct me. I'll try to get it right. If you like see me pointing here, it's to try to, make sure I'm not doing anything wrong. And then at the end of the slides here, I have a couple of games and a couple of resources for you. But I decided that, y'all were probably the experts in how to really get people engaged and motivated. So I'm going to kind of show you a little bit about what's out there, rather than having us necessarily play one here over Zoom or something like that. And, once again, happy to talk and facilitate and all that. So we'll go ahead and get started. And I will start by asking you, and when I say asking you, hopefully you'll talk back with me. Why do people work? Why do people choose to work? I'll go ahead and say this too, which I tell all my students. I'm a terribly awkward person. And so I'm perfectly comfortable sitting here in awkward silence until someone decides they want to talk back with me. So.
They like money.
Exactly. And you know what? Sometimes it's really hard to get students to just say that. People like money. What does work get us? Well, it gets us the things that we like. And literally, when you talk about work, you can, and actually economists frequently do, just equate money with consumption, because that's what money is, right? It's a means for us to go about consuming things. Now, we know why people work, and you're all people. Do you prefer to work, or do you prefer to not work?
That's a really tough question for teachers right now. They're going through so much.
Well, I mean, hopefully we all love our jobs to some extent, right? We understand that. I talk about the consumption value of education, the consumption value of work, but,
We've got a couple in the chat that say that they prefer to work.
They prefer to work.
Erica says, I prefer to work because I love my job. Eric said, most people do prefer to work, sense of accomplishment, providing services, etc.
Do you enjoy not working as well?
Sure.
I enjoy not working. I'll be the one to say it.
Right. We all like having some time when we're not at work. And so one thing that you're going to hear me refer to frequently throughout, kind of this presentation is this concept of leisure. And so economists, and specifically labor economists, will break down this work decision into labor and leisure. And really what it is it's a choice between leisure and consumption. And so once again with econ, sometimes terms are really straightforward and sometimes they can be a little misleading. And so I think that this term leisure can throw students off, because when you ask them, what is leisure? A lot of them will say maybe the things that we would typically think, right? And so I'm going to let Homer Simpson here kind of speak to this leisure consumption trade-off.
Oh, I have 3 kids and no money. Why can't I have no kids and 3 money?
Now, if you have children, I'm sure we've all been there at some point, right? Kids versus money. Well, guess what? If we're thinking about leisure, leisure is everything that's not work. So when Homer Simpson is talking about this trade-off between money and children, that's literally the consumption leisure trade-off that we all face. And so time with your family, that's leisure. Playing games, that's leisure. Doing housework, that's leisure. Might not seem very leisurely, but that's what we mean. And so when we're talking about all of these things that encompass what leisure is, that's what we're talking about. And once again, it's this idea of what can I do to consume versus what can I do with my time elsewise. So it's important to note that people like consumption, and hopefully we like work too, right? This consumption value of work, but people like leisure as well. Ideally, in a perfect world with infinite resources and time, we would just consume infinite amounts of stuff and infinite amounts of leisure, right? But as most of us know, if we want to consume more, have more books, I guess more guitars, bigger house, whatever it is that we want, right? Typically, we're going to have to give up some of that leisure, and we don't particularly like doing that. And of course, like a lot of things in econ, this is a trade-off. We have this trade-off that we have to make in order to kind of make those choices. And so every time I work, I have less time for leisure, but I get those wages that I can directly translate into consumption. And so throughout this kind of presentation, we're going to be talking about some of those things that make us choose to work or not work. And one of the things that I think you and your students will realize, really kind of regardless of level, is a lot of this is intuitive because we all face these kinds of decisions all the time. So let's talk a little bit about a labor market and talk about some of these choices to work and not work. Now, most of you have, taught econ, been to econ presentations. You're familiar with markets. Some of you probably even teach things about the labor market, but I encounter a lot of people and a lot of students who have to sit there for a minute with the labor market because it goes against a little bit what we're used to. So let me start by asking you, who supplies labor? Who is the supplier of labor?
Tara said community.
Community.
Vivian
Absolutely.
said people.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
Employees. Yeah. Human resources. We all supply labor in some form. People/citizens.
Exactly. People. People supply labor. And I feel like this is one of the first kind of stumbling blocks with students who, especially students who have had a little bit of econ before, because they're so used to associating supply with a company. But people supply labor. And since we're on this topic, since people supply labor, you literally sell your labor. What is the price for that labor that you're selling? What do we call that? When each of you sell your labor, what do you get?
Wages, pay,
Money.
salary.
Exactly, wages, money, right? That's the price for labor. And if we're thinking along those lines that people are selling their labor for money, for wages, then it becomes a little bit easier to think about who's demanding labor, which is whoever you're selling your labor to. Sometimes that can be yourself, right? You can be self-employed, a small business owner or something, but typically we would just leave that kind of general and think about it as the firm, right? So businesses. And I think that when students think that, especially if you have students who are kind of at the high school level who are getting their first job, they kind of get that at an intuitive level. They understand that, oh yeah, like it's whatever job that I have out there, they're the ones that are buying the thing that I'm putting out there. And it's nice because in this sense, we can put every single student in the shoes of a supplier, maybe for the first time. It's easy to put students in the shoes of a demander or a buyer. When we're talking about kind of the typical supply and demand model because they've bought things before. But this is one of those times where you can really kind of engage. You're the worker. You sell your wages, right? I'm sorry, you sell your labor. You get those wages. And here, and this is kind of something that's also a little bit, you can do it a few ways. But when we're thinking about quantity, often students will think about number of jobs as the quantity of labor. But you can kind of, it's all units, right? So you can just change that to labor hours too. And sometimes that's a little bit easier, right? Thinking about, oh, well, maybe I work an extra hour or something like that. So thinking about how all this goes. And one thing that you guys are going to realize also is these are from Saturday Morning Breakfast cereal, these comics. And they're my favorite because they always insult economists, okay? And so it's especially true, even if those students haven't necessarily had a job yet, often they've gotten an allowance or something along those lines. And hey, if you want to start talking about market power in a labor market, really using these fun terms like monopsony, you can tell them to start bargaining with their parents and see how well that goes, okay? So if you ever want comics that really stick it to economists, SMBC is great. So, warning though, sometimes there is language in those comics. So just putting that out there. All right, so let's really think about what makes those people who supply labor supply. And this is going to be something that kind of goes back to that framework that you're often going to develop with a basic supply and demand model. And so one thing that we've already talked about is this preference for labor or leisure and consumption. And once again, I do kind of want to emphasize here that this labor-leisure trade-off, labor and leisure can almost be considered the same, because if you are consuming labor, if you are engaging in labor, you are implicitly not engaging in leisure, right? So there's a direct negative relationship there, right? An inverse relationship. The more labor you have, less leisure you have, and vice versa, okay? And so you can kind of talk about them in the same breath. But one of the big things that's going to change people's supply of labor is their preferences for labor. And this is one of those things as well that is a chance for us as educators to really broaden the idea of what's making people work when we talk about preferences. Because preferences are kind of an intentionally vague term. If I say, what changes your preference to work? So each of you who has a preference to work, what are those things that change your preferences?
You guys are all welcome to unmute yourself, or I will continue Vanna Whiting the chat and reading it all off.
And you can just yell at me too. I'm cool with that. Prefer that.
Yeah, so you're welcome to unmute yourself and respond, or if you're more comfortable just putting it in the chat, that's fine too, and I'll be happy to read them off.
I was going to say maybe a change in your family situation.
Absolutely. And I can tell that I'm teaching to people or I'm talking to people who teach economics the way that you say that. Because a lot of students won't think, well, my family changed, nothing about me changed. Oh, absolutely it did. Absolutely. Did anything else that changes y'all's preferences for leisure or consumption?
In the chat, we have schedule, childcare, job changes,
Perfect.
pay.
Pay. We're going to get to pay. We're going to get to pay especially because we can think about pay a little bit differently too. But these are all really great things. And this is one of those, I don't know how deep y'all get into kind of like utility and preferences and all that, but it's one of those chances to think about how our life situations change how we like things, right? And so absolutely all of these things are going to change our preferences for leisure and change our preferences for consumption. And you can build so much into preferences, so much into preferences. And so, these are some of the ones that I've listed here, obviously not, all inclusive. You can put a whole bunch of things in there. We had a bunch, right? Maybe something we didn't talk about is levels of education, right? The more or less education you have might change your willingness to offer your labor out on the labor market, something like that. So we talked about wages. Another important concept here in this kind of labor supply decision, whether or not we're going to enter into the labor market, is this idea of reservation wages. And so one of the games that I like to play with my students are typically sitting in my, this is generally like a principals level type class. And I asked them, we have a hamburger restaurant right across the street from Winthrop University called Burgers and Barley. And I say, if Burgers and Barley were paying you $50 an hour right now, how many of you would still be sitting here? And generally I get a few laughs. I was like, no, I'm going. It's like, yeah, you should go over there and work for Burgers and Barley for $50 an hour. And it's this idea that there's generally a price for most things. And if that price dips too low, aka if wages dip too low, what incentive do we have to go work? But if that wage gets high enough, we're going to enter into that labor market and we're going to choose to start kind of trading our services, the services that we provide, our labor, on this labor market. So one other thing that we don't often necessarily immediately think of that will change our decision on whether or not we want to supply labor is non-labor income. And students often think non-labor income, how do you get money if you're not working? And so then I generally just ask, well, okay, if you don't have a job, do you starve to death? Most students say, no. And I say, okay, well, where does that money come from? And the answer is it can come from a lot of places. That money can come from, bequests from family members. It can come from public assistance programs. It can come from savings. But any of these things might change our willingness to work. And if you don't believe me, go win the lottery. And then I'll see if you're here next time. And so this is another kind of fun one to think about, where these non-labor income sources are and how they're going to affect our decisions. So one other thing, if you're talking about this with students, I'm a microeconomist, so I typically think about it at an individual level. Labor is one of those interesting topics that works very well at both a macro or micro level. And so if you're talking at a market level, obviously just the number of workers that are available out there will affect people's willingness to supply work. More people out there, more people willing to work for us. So things that change labor demand. This is kind of the other side of that market that we're going to have to think about and be able to talk with our students about. And so there are a number of things that will change labor demand. And often these are things that would affect a regular demand, right? Demand for any type of good or service. And so one that I also really enjoy talking about with my students is this change in the price or availability of a substitute for labor. And I ask my students, what is a substitute for labor? And so I'll ask you all, what is a substitute for labor?
New technology.
Machines.
Exactly. And this is something that also students really get at an intuitive level. So I say, how many of you last time you went to the grocery store did self-checkout, right? And we see this all the time. And by the way, if this is something that interests you and you want to go kind of read up further, skill bias technological change, this is probably 10, 15 years ago, was a really hot topic in labor economics. And it's all about this relationship of substitutes for labor. Or let me also say complements for labor. Because if I talk about self-checkout machines versus cashiers, everyone would say, oh yeah, right? We have these self-checkout machines, cashiers aren't working as much. Or, the next time you go through a drive-through, think about whether or not that's going to someone inside that building or to a centralized hub. And so you think, oh yeah, capital, machines, right? Technology, substitute for labor. But how about this? We can ask our students what kind of jobs they want, what they're interested in. And inevitably, some of them are going to say things like, I don't know, video game developer, right? Programmer, some of these kind of high-tech jobs. And I say, well, machines, technology, are those substitutes for labor in that case? And this is one of those fun ones to play with because it's not always the same. Sometimes machines, technology aren't substitutes, they're complements. And once again, look at us right now, right? Machines, aka this little camera that's sitting here staring me in the face, a complement to my labor, helping me become more productive, right? We wouldn't be able to do this otherwise in this type of atmosphere. So talking about those distinctions, talking about the relationship between people and technology, because I think that some of us might bring our own priors to the discussion and think that, oh, technological advancement is good or bad or however we want to think about it. But really it depends, and it depends on the industry. And as someone who studies poverty, that has vast implications for people in different sectors of the economy. So something to chew on a little bit. But you see a couple of the others here that are going to shift our labor supply or our labor demand curve. So here we have everybody's favorite supply and demand model. I'm sure that you've all seen this, you've all drawn it, you're all sick of it, and yet here we are. So supply and demand, it's inevitable, we end up here, but you see that it looks a little bit different. Obviously we have our nice downward sloping demand curve, our nice upward sloping supply curve. But up here we've got wages, right? Down here I have H for hours, my equilibrium, right? The intersection of supply and demand, where incentives are aligned. There's no excess supply, there's no excess demand. There's no pressure on the market to equilibrate. Here we have equilibrium wages and equilibrium hours, okay? So W star here, H star here. The going market wage rate, and at that wage rate, the amount of labor that people want to buy and sell. So typically as we're talking about these labor supply, labor demand curves, this comes relatively naturally. This W and H here, however you want to talk about it, can throw students off. If you don't want to put the H here, if you're like me and have students that don't like it when you change letters, put a Q. It's fine. Quantity of labor is a fine thing to talk about. It's the same. And if you want to talk about number of jobs, intuition's the same, right? However you feel comfortable and your students feel comfortable kind of approaching the topic. So just like any other type of supply and demand diagram you're going to see in your life, as we already talked about, things shift the demand curve, things shift the supply curve. When that happens, what's nice in this instance is that it works the exact same way. So here, we can have all kinds of things that are going to change our demand for labor, right? We talked about some of those. So the relationship between labor and machines, technology, capital, right? The number of firms that are out there. Excuse me. And so just like any other supply and demand diagram, if demand increases, the prices are going to go up. And in this case, that's wages. And so you can think and you can talk to your students, hey, if there are a bunch of firms moving into our area, so I'm here in Rock Hill, I'm sure many of you know the Panthers are moving their practice facilities to Rock Hill. Still in the works, despite COVID. And so I say, as this big company comes to Rock Hill, what do you think is going to happen to wages? And it's not even necessarily for people who might be employed by the Panthers, right? There's going to be spillovers. There's going to be those workers who they're going to want to eat lunch. They're going to want to go out, go to the movies, do something, right? And so the demand for labor is going to go up. And if that's the case, you see this increase in wages, this increase in hours that are out there on the market. Vice versa, our demand can decrease, just like you've seen at any other time. And once again, price and quantity goes down. And one thing that I like to emphasize with students, because in my experience, when I teach kind of these general overview classes, students initially stumble a little bit here because of the change in context. But I really try to emphasize at this point that everything that you've learned about supply and demand still holds. Nothing's changed. Now we just have different interpretations for what our prices and our quantities are. So I feel like I've been talking a lot. Let me pause for a second, ask, you're all following me? Does this make sense? Any questions?
All good.
All right. See, people are learning that I will sit here and stare at the camera like a sociopath. So once again, economist, not real human, right? So there's our demand curve, supply. I won't belabor the point, right? We can change our supply just like we've talked about in other times. And you know, this is one of those things where it's also fun, also fun to talk about students with these changes in supply, especially with regard to preferences, and especially for some of the things that we do, right? So we can talk about preferences for work, and a number of you said you loved your jobs, right? Said you loved your jobs. You're willing to increase your labor supply. You really supply our labor for maybe a lower wage than we might think would be appropriate for the types of things that are out there. It's a consequence of loving your job, right? You're willing to do things because you love it. Here, right, supply increases, prices go down, quantity goes up, wages go down, hours go up. Here, depending on what you're talking about in your class, you can talk about immigration. And you can talk about which sectors of the economy might be affected by that and how that's going to affect labor supply. A decrease in labor supply. We're going to hit on this one a lot more later on in these slides. But just like any other change in supply, decrease in supply pushes up wages, pushes down hours. So labor supply, labor demand. Chandler.
Jillian, did you have a question? I saw a little hand go up. You want to unmute yourself, or that may have just wanted to give you an opportunity to ask if you had it. Okay, we can.
All right. And once again, please feel free to just like take off the mute button and yell. All right. It's not going to bother me. I teach college students. So here, once you start talking about labor markets, labor supply, labor demand, wages, inevitably you get to unemployment. And I think that especially during the COVID-19 pandemic and with what we know has been going on with the unemployment rate, students are interested. What is unemployment? Why does it happen? And really, this is something that we need to clarify, because if students are paying attention to the media, to the news, they're going to hear this and equate unemployment with jobs. And to some extent, that's good, but to some extent, that's misleading as well. So this is the type of slide that we all know that we're never supposed to put up, because it's got a ton of words on there and no pictures, and it's miserable and it's all boring. But I did it anyway because, you know, why not? But
Dr. Morgan, can you, and I think you're about to do this, but can you expand a little bit on the different types of unemployed? You know, there's so many different ways, and then I keep seeing the variety of definitions, and
Sure, absolutely, Jim. So let's go back here to our kind of supply and demand model, all right, our basic supply and demand model. And this is something that I have coming up a little bit, but since we've got interest, let's do it now. So I'm assuming by your silence that you're all comfortable seeing this, okay? And so here, right, equilibrium hours, equilibrium wages. And so let me ask you, if the natural question is unemployment, where is unemployment on this graph? Where do we see it? By the way, it's kind of a trick question.
It's not there.
It's not there. It's not there. And in fact, however you want to shift these curves, however you want to shift those curves, there's no unemployment there, right? Because this wage and hours concept we have here is an equilibrium concept, right? And what we're saying here is that at this level of wages, right, these are the hours that people want to offer. And so if we think about what unemployment is, it forces us to think outside of an equilibrium framework, which we're not used to as teachers or students. Because here, as Jim asked, what are these different types of unemployment? Why does it happen? We have to think, what's going to push us out of this equilibrium? What's going to make us not be here to where supply and demand aren't, you know, kind of in perfect harmony, like we might like to teach our students, right? The invisible hand of the market, right? Equating the incentives of buyers and sellers, aka workers and firms. And so what might those things be? And so really there's all kinds of different reasons that might happen. And this is also where there are some pitfalls as we're teaching our students, because we don't want to be too cavalier with our discussions of unemployment, especially right now, especially with the climate right now. But we can ask, or we can think about reasons why people might not be employed, and as we're going to see, when they want to be. And there's all kinds of reasons there. And so, Jim, to get specifically to your question, what different types are there? You have to think about what's going to push us out of this equilibrium. Some of those things might be, well, what if we don't have good information? What if it's hard for workers to match with firms? Firms don't know exactly where to get the types of workers that they want. Workers are maybe spending a little bit of time out there on the market searching for the right firm. And so that might be something like, you know, frictional unemployment. That's my definition here, where there's labor market frictions that are preventing us from reaching this equilibrium point right away. There's a transition period. There might be things like structural unemployment, which is something else you might hear. And when I do that, I'm even going to use the example that I already had in the notes, just because I love the term, right? Does anybody here know what a Cooper is? No, I don't mean by a last name. Does anybody know what a Cooper is?
A car?
It can be a car, right?
Barrel maker.
Barrel maker. How many Coopers are out there currently? Anybody know one? So I actually bought I got my PhD at the University of Kentucky. I bought like an old bourbon barrel lid for a buddy of mine. I had his like name engraved on it, all that kind of stuff. But there aren't a whole lot of Coopers out there, or farriers, or you can just pick all these weird old jobs that students have no clue what they are, right? And you can say, well, where are those people? They're not there. Well, what happens to the people who were trained as Coopers, right? What happens to the people who were trained as, let's bring it up to modern times, like gas station attendants? Or what about those people who were, you know, programming in the old language they don't know anymore? The structure, the nature of our economy has changed. And we have workers who are having trouble getting back into the labor force because of those structural changes, structural unemployment. And so there are any number of things there that can cause that unemployment, that can cause it to be there. And another one that we'll often talk about is kind kind of policies that are there. And the common one that we're all going to be probably familiar with is minimum wage policy. That's a classic one that can drive unemployment, although as someone who does research on the minimum wage, let me tell you that the jury is still very much out on the effects of changes in the minimum wage. But anything that's going to prevent us from getting to that equilibrium. And in the real world, as we all know, the real world's messy. There's transition times, there's dynamics that change. And so that's kind of where some of those things come from. Was that a really long-winded way to answer your question, Jim? Yeah, you're welcome. One of the many services I offer, right? So as we're talking about unemployment, it is important, though, to be really clear on what we mean, right? And so I have these definitions up here. I'm not going to read to you. I'm assuming that you can all read. But one of the things that we need to remember is that just because someone doesn't have a job, that doesn't mean that they're unemployed, okay? And so we have to talk about, one, who's eligible to be employed. And so we typically say that's the civilian non-institutionalized population. So people who are eligible to work and who can go out on that labor market, right? Employed people, obviously, number of people who work. Unemployed, well, it's members of that civilian non-institutionalized population, right? And our labor force here, which is something that we're going to come back to, is the sum of these two, right? An important caveat here is for unemployed people, they're not working, but they have to actively be looking for work. If people are not actively looking for work, they are not unemployed because they're not in the labor force. We would say that those people are out of the labor force. And so when you hear about unemployment statistics, just know that that's only counting people who are actively looking for work. And so we'll talk about labor force participation. But depending on the level of your class, you can actually go about with some of these calculations, right? We can calculate the unemployment rate itself. We figure out the labor force. We figure out the people who are looking for work and are still part of the labor force. We get our unemployment rate. But one thing that students are probably not as familiar with, and maybe some of us aren't as familiar with, are this labor force participation rate. And if you go back to our initial discussions here, when I was kind of introducing this idea of what a labor market was, notice how I said, what makes you want to look for work? And a lot of you guys had those answers. But there are many things that might keep us from even starting that process. We're not going to be counted in the unemployment rate, okay? So I have an example here. It's algebra. I'll put it up on the screen. I'm not going to, at 7:37 at night, make you sit here and do algebra, because I know that's probably not your idea of a good time. I mean, once again, economists, not human, right? I like math. But you know, we can go through some of these examples, and textbooks have tons of these examples, right? These are the easy things to ask that aren't as fun to talk about. But we can go about calculating some of these unemployment rate. But it's nice here, if you kind of break it out like this, these are real examples. And you can ask, right, which of these people would be counted in the labor force? Which of these people would be eligible for work? And you can say, oh, you know, the people who are staying at home, right, who aren't looking for work, they're not in the labor force, right? These people aren't even part of the civilian non-institutionalized population. Retirees are not in the labor force, right? They're not unemployed, they're not in the labor force. So you can see where some of these calculations come from, right? There's 100 minus 5 minus 3. These people don't count. They can't be in the process of work. I'm not saying that, you know, our service veterans are not working. Please don't think that that's what I'm saying. It's just, you know, they're engaged in something very different, right? So we have 92 people kind of in that eligible population. Our labor force participation rate, people who stay at home don't count. People who are retired don't count, right? So here, 17 are looking for work, 50 are working. There's our labor force participation rate. And our unemployment rate is the fraction of those people who are in the labor force who are currently looking for work but aren't working. 17 out of 67 in this example, simplified example. I often will start with these kind of simple mock economies, because when you start talking about millions of people and have decimals up there, once again, students get confused. And I think that this is a good way to kind of introduce that idea to them. So here, now we get to the fun part, right? Which is where you get to look at pictures for most of the rest of the time, okay? So if you go back to one of those first slides, part of it is kind of setting up the stage to be able to talk about some of these really salient issues. And one of the things that I like doing with my students is just showing graphs and asking them what they see. And it gives me a really good chance to emphasize the role of data literacy and being a competent consumer of this type of information. And so here, and I'll talk about later, this is the current unemployment rate, pretty current. I might be a month or two off here. And I can ask students, what do you see? And really when I do this, I say, what's Molman's favorite game? This is what I call Molman's favorite game. And I leave it really vague on purpose because I want them to kind of dig into it, right? So one thing I might ask them is, what am I showing you? So what am I showing you here? What is this? And Jim, you're on mute, although I saw your mouth move.
That was intentional. I'm talking to myself. But, the people who are unemployed.
Exactly, right? And so what do we see here? We see things going up and things going down. When do things start going up? When does the unemployment rate start going up?
After the recession.
Exactly. We're directly seeing these recessions, and that's what these gray bars are. So these are the recessions as defined by the National Bureau of Economic Research. And you can go back here to the Great Recession. You can come back here to the dot-com boom and bust of the early 90s, our double dip recession in the early 80s, right? And we can see that during those recessions, we see unemployment rates start to creep up, right? And, you know, this, I think right here is going to be very fresh in students' minds, right? They're very aware of COVID, but, you know, especially leading up to the election, right? We heard a lot about, oh, you know, unemployment rate's the lowest it's been in really a very long time, at least a very long time, right? And so we see a drastic change. And, you know, prior to a couple of months ago, this is what I would focus in on, right? The Great Recession, where we hit near record level highs of unemployment. But now, like, this is just so insane, right? Seeing here 15% unemployment, right? And we can kind of look at it and see what's happening. And we know that as these goes up, as the unemployment rate goes up, recessions, bad for the economy. Why is it happening? These are all conversations that we can have. And depending on what you like talking about with your students, if you like getting down into nitty-gritty details, once again, not human, right? You can talk about what the definition of a recession is and how really it's kind of whatever we want it to be. We declared this recession pretty much right away. A lot of people tell you there's a certain number of quarters that have to go with negative growth for that to happen. There's a lot of flexibility there if you look at official definitions. So you can kind of zoom in here and pick some of these. And I don't know what types of classes each one of you teaches, but you might have your own interests, right? So maybe some of you really like talking about oil and gas prices. And so you can set the stage and start telling a story about the early 80s, right? Or maybe a lot of you really like talking about technology and, you know, wowing your students with tales of before the internet existed. And so you can talk about these dot-com boom and busts, right? Or me, this is right about the time I graduated from college, and I can talk about what it was like entering a labor market in the midst of the Great Recession and maybe why it made sense for me to go to graduate school at that time. Because each one of these recessions is different to some extent or another, and they affect people differently. And once again, this is something that's very much on students' minds right now. And so in my experience, I get a lot of interaction here. I get a lot of people who are like, well, why did this happen? Why is it so high here? All of those kinds of things. So here's our unemployment rate. We can track it over time. We can see how it changes. And it's a nice contrast to that pretty graph that we had previously, because we don't typically think of out of equilibrium consequences, right? We want to talk about all those different types of, well, Jim, per your question earlier, right? Different types of unemployment, frictional unemployment, where people are, this is the standard one, right? The one that happens. Most of us in this room have probably transitioned jobs at some point or another, experienced short spells of unemployment, right? There's some friction in making those matches, right? Structural unemployment, when the structure of the economy changed. So to give you an example of this, when the COVID-19 pandemic first hit, I sit on, not a voting member, but the Fort Mill Economic Partners. And they were asking me what I thought about the current recession. And I said, well, one good thing is it's not like the Great Recession because there hasn't been any big structural change. If you guys remember during the Great Recession, right? Financial markets went haywire. and people stopped knowing what things were worth, right? We had a pretty good idea of once that hit that the whole financial sector was going to have to fundamentally change. And if you go back to our unemployment rate graph, you can really see that in terms of how long it took us to hit pre-recession levels of unemployment, right? So here, officially ended in 2010, even though it still kept going up, right? It took us about 5 years for recovery after that. Compare that here, right, to about 3 years, 2 years to hit pre-recession levels, although it started high, right? You can think about how these different types of unemployment affect things. So we have cyclical unemployment due to the nature of the business cycle. For whatever reason, COVID-19 happens, perhaps, right? Business cycles change, unemployment changes. One that I didn't mention that I probably should have is seasonal unemployment, which as someone who, when they were in high school, did work at the calendar stand in the mall during Christmas time. Lovely job. I recommend everybody do it. It's totally not soul crushing. No, it actually was a really good job, but you can see that as seasons change, right, certain types of sectors become more or less in demand. So in the winter, we have a lot of retail sales that happen, right? In the summer, we have a lot of agricultural business that happens, which might be particularly relevant for South Carolina, right? And really it is, there's an adjustment process. And that adjustment process takes more or less time depending on what's going on in the labor market. So once again, not to belabor graphs, but you see that I'm doing this as if you can see what my hands are doing right now. I should know better, right? You can see right here that it's when we're out of equilibrium, when the quantity of labor demanded is not equal to the quantity of labor supplied, right? When labor supply, the quantity supplied of labor outstrips the quantity demanded, that's unemployment, right? When there are more people on a labor market than firms are willing to hire. That's what unemployment is, okay? And to go back to at least showing you some pretty pictures, right? One thing that you can also emphasize is that we think about this. We think about national unemployment rates, but unemployment rates differ state by state. And, you know, we're all here in South Carolina, differs city by city, county by county. And all different kinds of reasons exist for why there might be a differential unemployment rate. And so, you know, you might talk about students. What do you guys know about the geography of the United States? What do you know about the people who are in Florida versus the people who are in California or Nevada, or the businesses that are in Texas and Louisiana? Why do we think some of these places might have higher unemployment rates versus lower? And the nice thing here is there's not necessarily a 100% right answer. You can do some exploring with your students and start thinking about these differing levels of geography and how unemployment changes there. So I realize that I'm kind of running out of time a little bit because once again, talking, economist, all that. But let me ask you guys this to give you a very real world example of how unemployment can differ, how labor markets can differ. So this was the most recent data I could find on unemployment rates in various counties in South Carolina. I don't know where each of you are from, but in December 2020, unemployment in Horry County, South Carolina was 6.1% compared to 4.6% in Spartanburg County. So that might seem small, what, 1.5 percentage points? 1.5 on a basis of 6 is relatively large. Why do we, this is a pretty substantial difference in the same state. Why do we see such a substantial difference in unemployment rates in South Carolina?
Seasonal
Because
unemployment was Horry County, Myrtle Beach's tourist destination.
So it's interesting too, depending once again on how in the weeds you want to get, because these are actually seasonally adjusted unemployment rates, but you're still right because it's what's happening in these different counties, right? What's happening to the tourism industry during the COVID-19 pandemic and the likelihood that people are going to want to go to hotels, restaurants, things like that. If those types of businesses don't have patrons, what happens to the demand for labor in those areas? Versus places where labor market conditions might be different. And this is something, once again, that we all experience, right? Different industries are affected differently by different labor market pressures. And because there's a differential effect there, we're going to see that directly translate into unemployment rates. And so, you know, I'm a relatively recent transplant to South Carolina. You all know the geography and the economy much better than I do here, but you can start picking here with your own knowledge, right? Maybe you have a family member that lives in city X, and you can talk about what you know about city X, or ask your students, right? Where do your grandparents live? Where do your friends live? And ask them, how are those labor market conditions different? Because they're going to be, inevitably they're going to be, because they differ by all different kinds of things. So depending on what you fancy, what you like to talk about, you can talk about racial and ethnic disparities in unemployment, and you can talk about how they've persisted over time. And so here, right, this is data from the US Census Bureau, and you can talk about, depending, especially for those of you who might also teach government or history or something like that, why we might see historically higher rates of unemployment for Black or African American individuals compared to individuals who are white or Asian. How about Hispanic or Latino individuals? Something else that you can ask students, look at these gaps. What's happened to those gaps over time? And this is a great point. I teach a class in poverty, but it's a great point to bring up history. It's a great time to kind of think about some of the broader implications of a labor market and what might be out there. You can talk about, one thing I often talk about is education and what unemployment looks like for people of different levels of education. And so you all are working with young students who are probably starting to think about college, think about their trajectory. And these are types of graphs that you can show and say, hey, now this is an employment rate, right? So slightly different here. But you can see that, look, even in the midst of 2007, 2008, 2009, right? Look at the changes in the employment rate for college men and college women versus non-college men and non-college women. Or something else that you can ask is, why are these different for men and women? And so that's something that we'll talk about a little bit later. Well, we won't. We have 6 minutes left. But it's one of those things that can bring up a lot of discussions, especially for us who are interested in history. So I'll go through some of these graphs relatively quickly. But one thing as educators that I do like to emphasize is the role that education plays in labor market outcomes, both in terms of here, you see unemployment rate, but you also see earnings. And we can talk about the direct correlation, really the direct causal link between education and earnings, education and employment outcomes. Okay.
Does this include debt too? So, you know, the discussion about college loan and all that. So, you know, you can make a lot more money if you got a PhD, but in fact, you have a higher debt early on.
So this is only median weekly earnings. This does not include debt. However, it's not terribly difficult. If you guys want resources, I can provide them to you, where you can track average levels of college debt over time and actually the composition of that debt, or at least composition of student aid, typically what I focus on. And you can also talk about whether or not that's a good trade-off to make. And depending on, once again, what your interests are, you can go look up employment rates on sector. You can go look up average starting salaries based on college degree. And you can have these conversations about whether or not it's worth it to take on that level of debt. And this might be anathema to some of us here, but I'm not the type of person that's going to tell you that a 4-year degree is the key to all future success. As someone whose, you know, father was a bagger at Publix and whose stepfather was an animal control officer, dog catcher. My mom has done everything from being a lunch lady to being someone who helps people move. You know, jobs are jobs and people have different ways to be happy. So one thing that I do want to emphasize in the few minutes that I have left, because I alluded to it earlier and I think it's important. Here what we have is the labor force participation rate over time. And this is something that does not get talked about as much in terms of popular discussion about labor markets. And it's something that paints a very different picture. And because we don't have a whole lot of time, I'm just going to go kind of come out with the punchline, which is take a look here, kind of as labor force participation is increasing, and take a look here as it's decreasing. Obviously during COVID, right, labor force participation dropped heavily. People aren't looking for jobs, right? They're dropping out of the labor force. But that's not a new phenomenon. Take a look at the Great Recession and what started happening after that. We had the lowest levels of unemployment that we'd seen in decades. At the same time, we had the lowest levels of labor force participation that we'd seen in decades, right? Prior to COVID-19, we hadn't seen that level of labor force participation since the early 1980s. And so while unemployment rates are low, you have record numbers of people who were sitting out of the labor market, choosing not to work. And so especially if you're interested in something like poverty, it's not necessarily only the unemployment rate that you want to consider. It's just labor force participation rate. And inevitably the question is, why is it going down? And I would say that, we can all get a PhD and start talking about it because, you can write papers, and papers have been written as to why. One thing that's fun to talk about here is, well, this is a big increase, right? You can ask students what's happening in the 50s, 60s, 70s. What's changing labor market so much? And I know this is being recorded, but this is usually where I pull out the sex, drugs, and rock and roll, right? You have the sexual revolution going on, women entering into the labor force, right? A very different type of world was happening right here, and you directly see that in terms of labor force participation rates. So it's one thing that I would say, if you want to talk about value added in terms of what students are going to be hearing in the news versus what might be salient, I think talking about labor force participation is a good way to start kind of going about that. So once again, we're running out of time. Let me spend a few minutes just kind of giving you guys some resources here. So once again, I can talk forever, boring like that, but the labor market can be fun, I promise you. All right. There are ways to do these games where you can have a lot of fun. You can make certain people employers. You can make certain people workers. You can randomize levels of education and give them different objectives. And I'll provide these slides, but I have links to all of these in the slides. So if you're interested in, doing some of these games in your classes, here's a lot of resources. One thing that, once again, nerd, right, that I think is fun is looking at data. And you can do this in real time. And some of you might be very familiar with some of these sources, but these are just some of my kind of thoughts as, I pull data from some of these different places. But you can get, as recent as December 2020 in terms of unemployment rate data based on county in South Carolina. And so if you want to really bring home what unemployment is in your classroom, right, what better way than to track the unemployment rate in this county or the city or, the locality of your choosing, right? So the Census Bureau has really good kind of general reports where you can pull some of this big data. BLS is where you can get a little bit more nitty gritty. BEA is something I don't use as much, but they do have some good kind of industry level things that you might be interested in. And Fred's a good one-stop shop. What I will say is that I don't like the search functionality in Fred itself. Our benevolent overlords Google, they've perfected it. So usually I will just Google, right, Fred unemployment rate or something like that. And you can pull those things in real time. You can zoom in and they're interactive, and it's something great to do in real time, especially even in a Zoom environment where you can just say, hey, let's look at this stuff. So here are some resources for you. And then let me leave you with one final thing, which is a word of warning. I love talking about labor markets, but labor markets are personal. And so especially right now, students almost certainly are seeing friends and family and loved ones who are having trouble in labor markets. And we all know that we have students who come from a variety of backgrounds. And so we don't want to be too cavalier talking about job loss or talking about why people are paid different wages. We want to make sure that we're emphasizing that, there's nothing wrong with an honest day's work, whether you're an engineer, right, or a construction worker or whatever, right? We don't know what our students are or where they are. And at least in my opinion, you can't talk about labor without ultimately getting to poverty and why people don't work. And poverty can be something that's very personal for our students as well. But I think that students like having this power. Whenever I usually go off on some rant on labor markets in class and when I'm not supposed to, and students actually really get into that. I've had students already this semester ask me about unemployment rates, asking me about minimum wages and things like that. So thank you all so much for being here. I really, really appreciate it. I think I got you with 1 minute to spare. But seriously, if you want to ask me questions, talk to me, provide me company in these lonely times, here's my contact information. I'm more than happy to provide whatever resources I can. So, for those of you who have to leave, please do so, but I would love to answer your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mullen. That was wonderful. I learned a lot too. I think that it's so important to include, like you said, this graphic imagery and this, the data literacy, just for students to see things from Fred and all the other sources. So I am going to drop, for those of you who are ready to roll, it is almost 8 o'clock. I've dropped the Google form in to get credit for attending tonight's session. It also includes a review and feedback of tonight's session. So if you've got great things to say, I see a lot of thank yous in the chat, etc. Please share those out with us. We will share those with Dr. Molden. He'll probably stick around for a few minutes if any of you guys have any specific questions.
I'm gonna stop
we'll hang
the share.
out, but as far as tonight, once you fill out the evaluation form, you are good to go. One last thing, I'm going to do one commercial. I'm going to take 5 seconds. There are a few South Carolina financial literacy master teachers in with us tonight, but if you are not one of them, I highly suggest you contact me and ask me a little more about that program. It is a incentivization for you spreading your knowledge and sharing professional development with other educators in your building, within your district, about financial literacy. So thank you for those who have attended. Yes, we got some thumbs up, some people who are supporting the program. But if you are not familiar with it, I'll definitely include something in the follow-up. And speaking of follow-up, I will also include the presentation from tonight so you guys have access to all of this wonderful information. All right, I'm going to stop talking so you guys can ask questions. Thank you all for coming.